Hey guys, this is BenCB for Raise Your Edge, and today we will talk about a very special topic, because today we talk about the technical tools. So we talk about stats, HUDs, and about a clear node system. At first we'll talk about how you can construct an optimal node system. Then we look at important stats for 6-max hyperturbo sit and goes. I will explain how you should interpret all the stats, and I will show you common mistakes that often take place. Then we look at a HUD, what you could use, and I will show you how to construct it when you're a bit lost with this topic right now. We will do the same for the node system, so how do you create a clear node system? But let's start with a few tips. It's important that your HUD is short and precise, so don't write a novel in the node window. Remind yourself that you have to read this node in seconds or in split seconds, and that's why it is important that there are no long sentences. It's better that you have many abbreviations and also instructions. You should use abbreviations that you can use all the time. So don't use one abbreviation one time and the other time you use another abbreviation. This will confuse you a lot, and that's why you should use uniform abbreviations or shortcuts. Then it's important that you separate the different areas visually. For example, in post-flop, re-steal, heads up, and bubble. I see it very often that people just write down all their nodes one after another. So you see a post-flop node, then a heads up node, then a bubble node, then again a post-flop node. You have to read all the nodes to find the node that you need right now for this specific spot. And as an example, sometimes you have to read the post-flop nodes to find the bubble nodes. You lose so much time with that. It's not very effective. It's important that you have a visual separation that is useful structured, and that you just look at the correct area that you need. With this concept you don't have to read all the other nodes, cause it's just a waste of time and brings you nothing. What I maybe forgot in the beginning, many of you will think, oh, I play on the lower levels and these players are so bad, I don't need nodes. I think that's very dangerous, cause now you look this video series, so you have the plan to move up in stakes, and the sooner you start with writing nodes, the easier it will be in the future. In the beginning it takes some willpower to mark hands and write the node, but really fast it becomes a habit. You make the nodes in-game when you have the time, and especially on the mid and low stakes. I think it's so important to write nodes, cause so many players don't do it. Many regulars don't pay attention to balancing, and that's why a node often has so much value. Of course, the player pool is huge, and to get into the same spot with the same regular does not happen that often than on higher stakes. But when you have nodes with same regular in the same spot, you can just crush your opponent, and that's the reason why so many regulars don't pay attention to balancing. But you shouldn't do the same thing, and with that you can achieve a huge edge on your opponents, cause they think that you would never note some bad sizing tells or ranges when they make a strange turn or river play, and you can gain so much edge in these spots, and this is where you should note every strange play from your opponents. I also did it against fish, cause sometimes you play against the same fish, and when you know it's a maniac, you can save a lot of money, and we can rogue lighter or raise call lighter, but especially against regulars it's important, and you should start with it on the lower stakes. This is not a spot in which you can gain a marginal edge. You can really make a lot of money in those spots, especially cause so many regulars multi-table really hard and don't pay attention to balancing. What's also important is that the notes are up to date, so you should delete all notes that are older than 6 months or rewrite the notes. Because many players improve their game, you can keep the notes about the player type. For an example, when you moved up in stakes and another regular also moved up in stakes, it is likely that he also improved his game. So pay attention that your notes are up to date. You can use NoteCaddy badges for frequent situations. How this works, this is not the topic from this video. I think Chris can help you with that. Let's look at a hand in which I made my decision based on a badget, and will show you how these badgets help you at the tables. You can make a faster decision, so you save time and you can play more tables this way. We have a hand from a $200 Hyper Sit and Go, and it was played on PokerStars. The cutoff a regular jams, and we have to make the decision if we want to call or fold. When we look at it in the resource calculator, then we see that when the cutoff jams a 33% range, we have a clear fold with ace-6 suited. We still have 11.6 big blinds, so he will trap a lot of hands, kings, aces, and ace-king suited is for sure in the min-raising range. Some players also trap queens and ace-king offsuit. Then we see that we have a close fold with our hand, and we should fold our hand. We have a solid stack and we don't have to take a marginal spot. When we put ace-king offsuit in the range, then it's a close call, but we don't have to take this spot either. We have a solid edge and we should skip a call like that, unless it's a very tough sit and go. But you should pay attention that you only play the soft tables. Okay, how did the NoteCaddy badget help me? I saw that when he has 10, 11 or more big blinds, he even min raises pocket 9s and pocket 10s to induce a rejam. Also hands like ace queen. I saw that, and that's also important that you note it, because then you can call loser against his pushing range. When you play many tables, you have often the situation that you have a tough situation and very little time. Nowadays, it's very important that you can make your decision in a very short time, and these NoteCaddy badges help you enormously, because you get a very good overview about this opponent in a short time period. In this case, I created a badget. It's the phone icon, and this badget tells me that he pushes a very capped range. We could also note for 10 big blinds and more, but this is enough for me. So I use this badget when players min raise 9s, 10s, jacks, queens, ace suited, ace queen offsuit. With this, I see that I have to call loser in game, because many players on the low and mid stakes make the mistake that they don't call loose enough against these capped ranges, or they just don't note it. I will talk later a bit more about taking notes on the low and mid stakes, because I think I have a different opinion than some of you. But for this concrete spot, I chose the phone icon. It is very important that you know on the first view what this symbol means. You can also create your own icons. As you can see, I have the note that he second barrels light, so I already know how I want to defend preflop against him. I know that he is very aggressive, so I have to adjust my preflop defending range a bit. And I get a good overview from this player, and I don't have to open the note window. Of course, I wrote down some more concrete notes there. When I have more time, I read it as well, with which hands he barreled or how he jams. But for this situation in game, it's super important, and it also often happens that many of you take many notes but overlook the needed note because you have so many notes and it's really confusing. or you just forgot to look it up cause it was a standard spot. You play this hand always this way and you think this spot is standard. I don't have to look in the note window. And in hindsight you see, oh, I had a special note on him and you just forgot to read the note. What's also important is that when you have these badges, you don't have to create a new one for every opponent. When you have a player that also second barrels light or that jams a cap pushing range, then you can just add opponents to the list. It's very simple and this don't takes a lot of time. But it's so good to give you a very fast and detailed overview about your opponent, because you can create badges for every situation. When you have players that 3-bet very aggressive preflop and you forget it all the time, then just create a badge for this. That when you're in middle position, you see, oh, on the button is this aggressive 3-better, I should open raise tighter. You can create the badges yourself with paint, as you can see in my first badget, or you just pick one of the pre-made icons. When I don't have the badget, I would only discount kings, aces and ace king suited, maybe pocket queens, so I would fold ace 6 suited. I would probably call ace 8 offsuit, ace 7 suited plus, king queen suited, pocket 5s plus, and yeah, king jack suited too. King queen offsuit, it depends how soft the table is, but I think I would call this hand too. But I would fold pocket 4s and I would fold ace 6 suited as well. So let's look at the EV when villain jams this range. Now we see that we have so much EV now. We had minus 0.16 and now we have plus 0.81. And we can call hands like ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited, pocket 4s, ace 8 offsuit, ace 7 offsuit, even king 10 suited. So we can call way looser than Nash. And you can see when you fold all the time those hands, then you make a huge mistake. And that's why it is important to look which hands are in his min raising range and note it. When you saw that this player min raises ace queen with 10 or 12 big blinds, because then when he jams you can discount those hands. Now we can say he min raises also a hand like king 9 offsuit, queen 7 suited and king 4 suited. I think he will jam all the other hands. To balance his range he will sometimes raise a hand like king 3 suited or 10-7 suited. To call the small blind push, we could fold against the button, it depends. He has just 8 big blinds, but we can fold against the 8 big blind shove too, when he is a really tight player, but against me he can min raise fold. And you can see even then we can call way looser than before. King 10 suited and ace 4 suited is a fold now. But when we fold ace 6 suited all the time, we lose an EV of 0.74 every time. Before we had an EV of minus 0.16 and now our EV is 0.6, and that's a huge difference. When he jams all the weaker hands like king 9, then the call is even more profitable and we lose more EV when we fold. You can see that you can help yourself with very little effort. You can play more tables, you can push your hourly, and you also improve your theoretical knowledge. You also work with the ranges, so you train with hands you call, so you improve your ICM game. I hope this example could help you to understand it better. When you need help in this regard, just message Chris or me. I also have a lot of knowledge about badges and we can create individual badges for you. Now we look into the node system. How can you create a system like that? You should see how this can look like. That's just a suggestion from me. I have the following notes on him. On the top we see which poker format we play. When you only play hyper sit and goes, you can remove that. As I told you, try to keep it as short as possible. In the first area, I write down all things about his push and call tendencies. So everything about the bubble, pushing and calling ranges. I separate it with the hashtag. Then I write everything down about steal, re-steal and complete. I separate it with the plus signs. Then we have the post-flop area and I separate it with these signs. When I have more than one node, I separate it with the same signs, as you can see. And heads up, I separate it with this line when I have more nodes than this one. When you want to separate it better, it can look like this. When I have a steal node, I write it down at the top of this area. So even in the different areas, I know what's at the top and in the middle. I write the case statement in uppercase letters, and with the line I write down the concrete node. So when I want to review this player later, or when I have the time in-game, I write down open raise 8-7 offsuit on the cutoff with 15 big blinds. And we separate it with the plus signs. Then we come to his re-steal tendencies. When I have the node that he re-steals very aggressive, then I write down the specific situation. So for an example, with the second chip lead. Because we always have to look at the stack size. There are players which are very tight with some stack sizes, but when they can overtake the chip lead, they are super loose and aggro. So we write down 5-4 suited, 13 big blind, small blind against button. You can also separate the nodes with the shorter plus line, and when the area is over, we have the long plus line. We can do the same thing for the post-flop area. When I have a tough spot against this opponent regarding steal-re-steal, I can look into this area. I know the steal is right on top, and I know re-steal is in the middle and complete is at the bottom. So you can create your whole node window this way. The same applies for his push and call tendencies. And sure, you can change this. For an example, you can say I just want the steal-re-steal area on top, create it just how you like it. But I really like the structure, and I think it's a really clear structure. When you have many nodes, then we can write down concrete instructions. So we write down against him, we should raise fold very few hands. We shouldn't play back at his limps. Don't hero fold post flop cause he's very aggressive with draws. Heads up 10 big blinds, re-steal a lot cause we have the note on the bottom that he raises jack-3 offsuit with 10 big blinds. And attack his completes when we are heads up. We want to write down concrete instructions, and then we have a very good game plan against him. Yeah, we write down on the bubble when he is the second chip lead. Then we have a nice instruction. What could we also write down? Re-steal against his cutoff open raises with 13 big blinds, very light. So you put all your nodes into this small text. When you start your session and you have not too many tables open, you can open some node windows. And then you read the concrete instructions and you have them in your head and you remember those in the concrete spots. When you don't have concrete instructions, then read your notes. This will also give you a good understanding of their game. But I really like the concrete instructions. We can also write down a lot about his post-flop play. How does he c-bet? Is he a calling station? Does he have a huge leak? Is he barreling a lot? Is he passive or aggressive? So when you have concrete notes, write it down to exploit him later on. Let's move on to the important stats for 6max Hyper Turbo Sit and Goes. In my opinion, it is advisable to use panels. I don't want to tell you that this is the only real method. there are a lot of opinions and it also depends on your personal preferences. This should just be advice or a structure for you, especially when you haven't looked deeply into this topic or you just have a very small HUD. So you have a very small HUD but you don't know which stats you should add, or you have too many stats and it's very confusing. I prepared something for the beginners and advanced players how you can structure your stats. As I told you, I really like the use of panels. Panels are little areas. So you have 3 small HUDs for one player. We'll take a closer look at it later on. In the first panel we have preflop and overall stats. In the first line we have name and hands, and also the fold to forward stat. The fold to forward stat is there cause we had some space left. You can also put this stat in another line. Normally you have the raise stats for the position and the 3-bet stats for the different positions. But when we talk about 4-bets, we just have 4-bet and full to 4-bet. That's why I put this stat in the first line. In the second line we have VPIP, PFR, 3-bet, aggression factor and hands. Then we have the raise first in stats for early position, middle position, cutoff button and small blind. And many players don't have these stats. They just have the steal stats and VPIP and PFR. But when you use these stats, you will see that the stats in early position and middle position are so different between the players. When we move up in stakes to the $60, $100, $200 level, some players are very loose in early position or extremely tight. And there is not too much content out there for 6-max hyper turbo sit and goes. That's why some players just play by feeling. And that's why it is important to have those stats, cause we can bluff through it a lot against a loose early position raiser. The same applies to the 3-bet stat. In this case, we take the 3-bet stat against early position, middle position, cutoff button and small blind. The versus hero stats are in brackets behind or on one column beneath. I will tell you later more about that. Then we have the fold to 3-bet stats for early position, middle position, cutoff button and the small blind. You will see that it is burning money when you only use the overall stats, so 3-bet overall and fold to 3-bet overall, cause there are players which 3-bet a linear range against every position, so tight versus early position, normal against middle position, normal to loose against the cutoff, and loose against the button, and very loose against the small blind, which also makes sense. But then there are racks which 3-bet totally random, so sometimes they 3-bet way too loose against the button or way too loose against the cutoff. Most players bluff 3-bet similar ranges against the cutoff and button, so you can defend way more hands against the 3-bet with a call or with a jam. The same applies for the fold to 3-bet stats. Some players have really huge leaks in some positions, and when you only have the overall stat, you may be 3-bet against the position in which he does not overfold, and against the other positions in which he folds a lot, you're just too tight. There are players that have fold to 3-bet stats in early position and middle position of 70 or 80%. And cutoff button they have 40 to 50. And when you know their tendencies, you can exploit them so hard. The second panel is for the post-flop stats. It is structured for every street, though in the first line we have the flop, the second is a turn, and the third is the river. In the third line we have also some additional stats. We have the raise c-bet stat for the flop, donk flop, and then we have full to donk flop. These are all stats in which most opponents are very unbalanced, so there are racks which donk a lot on the flop, there are racks which donk nothing, There are regulars that play very honest against donks, so we can donk a lot against them, and there are players that are very aggressive against donks. Okay, then first stat we have c-bet flop and the fold to check raise flop. They are connected to each other, that's why we have this stat in brackets behind. So when you have the decision if you want to defend this hand passive and you see he c-bets a lot, at first it's a good thing when you make your defense based on his c-bet stats, but you can add another thing. Don't only look at the open raise and the c-bet stat. Also look if he folds a lot to check raises or to flop donks. That's the next step. Maybe he has some other leaks. There are also racks which have 20% turn c-bet, or they play something like 100, 20, 40. And against those players you can float a lot of flops and then bet the river yourself to take it down. You have a lot of options to find leaks, and the same applies to the fold to flop stat. Often we have the situation that the sample size on the river is very low. I forgot one stat, the bet versus missed c-bet stat. Also a very interesting stat, cause some players are really aggressive against checks from the preflop raiser. So when we have the situation that we decide not to c-bet the flop as a preflop raiser, some players have a very high stat like 50, 60, 70%, and we should check a lot against those players. Sure, there are also racks which only have 30, 40%, but everything over 50, 60 we should check call a lot or check raise when the board is very draw heavy. Okay, let's move on to the third panel. The third panel is for the steal situations, especially for blind versus blind situations. So we have fold big blind versus small blind, call big blind versus small blind, and 3-bet big blind versus small blind. I think these stats are the most important ones. We'll see that the deviations from the fold versus button stat are not so huge, because in this situation we look how much the blinds 3-bet, because we have no problem when he only defends passive. Then we play in position, that's not a problem. So I think the 3-bet versus button stat is more important, and that's why in my HUD are only the first 3 stats. You can also use the versus hero stats when you have a high sample size or you play against some regulars very often. Let's look into an example HUD now. How can a HUD look like? We take the player on the button, we have the most sample size on him. We see that the structure is similar to the foils I showed you. I changed it a little bit. The fold to 4-bet stat is now right on top. Usually I also have name, hands and fold to 4-bet. I removed his name cause I think he doesn't want that. I analyze his stats with his name here. In the first line we have VPIP, PFR, aggression factor, 3-bet, and I don't use any abbreviations for these stats. I think you can remember all those stats. For the other stats I have abbreviations. This depends how fast you can remember these things. Though I just wrote what stats are in the specific row. The third line we have the raise first in stats, and we start with early position, then middle position, cut off, button and small blind. This also makes sense. Maybe this HUD is a bit huge for you right now. It also depends how fit you are with HUDs and stats. When you have your own system, that's great, but when you watch this video you have the one or another leak that you want to fix. You have too many stats and it's confusing, or you use no stats at all so far. You only have the standard HUD with VPIP, PFR and 3-bet. That's not up to date and you lose a lot of value with that, and that's why this HUD should just be a framework for you. when you use no stats or very few stats so far, then you gradually add stats. I would never advise you to add all the stats right now. You don't know where is which stat, and you can't really work with all the stats, and this will take some time. Which stat tells me that he is way too tight or way too loose, or when can I exploit something. When you have right now only the stats VP, IP, PFR, 3-bet and aggression factor, I would advise you to add the race first in stats. Try to focus on the stats and try to exploit your opponents with these. After that, you add the full 2 3-bet row. You try to mix in some bluff 3-bets in your game. On which positions do they have leaks? This player on the button folds a lot to 3-bets. He folds 67% on the button. And he's very loose in the small blind with 86%. Then I would add the 3-bet row, so how much does he 3-bet against the different positions. And we can see on the button very good why this is important. He has a 3-bet small blind stat of 64%. And his overall 3-bet stat is 13%. When we would only look at his overall stat, we would never see this huge deviation. We could think when his overall 3-bet stat is 13, then it's likely that he 3-bets 20% against the small blind, and against early position 7-8%. Cause he will not 3-bet against every position 13%. But that the deviation is so huge, you would never see that, and that's why it's so important to look at the positions for the race first in, the full 2 3-bet, and for the 3-bet stat. Some players have massive leaks in some positions, and when you only have the overall PFR or the overall 3-bet stat, we would never see his real tendencies. We should reshove a lot against his button open raises or 3-bet a lot. And when we would only look at his overall full 2 3-bet stat, we wouldn't see anything. Of course, you can color code all the stats how you like it, just to see it easier. So when you know the race first in stats are green, you can just see it with one view. And then he folds in 63% of the time to a check raise. So when he checks the flop very often, we see the turn for free without calling a flop c-bet, so we can realize our equity better. That's why we can defend a bit lighter preflop, cause he folds so much to raises, we can raise more bluffs against him. What's also important is that we shouldn't bluff the turn too often in position or out of position, cause he has a stronger checkback range, cause he c-bets not too much and then he folds a lot to raises. This just tells me that his checkback range is stronger. So we can find out a lot about this player, and when you realize those things, write it as an instruction in your note window. We should defend preflop lighter. We should bluff raise more hands on the flop and don't bluff so much against his checkbacks. This is very important. We should have a lot of equity. And in the second line we see full to c-bet 51 and full to turn c-bet 0 and full to reverse c-bet 67. On these stats we can see that we shouldn't bluff second barrel against him. We can play our standard c-bet game on the flop. He has a normal full to c-bet stat. And when we decide to c-bet the turn, we have to also fire the river very often. All his other stats look okay. Bet versus missed c-bet, he has 27% in position. So this tells me that we should bet ourselves very often, because his stat is on the lower side. He's just often checking back. He's very trappy. And when we check the flop behind, he attacks the turn in 43% of the time. 43 is a solid stat. There are players with a lower number, so we could trap check some hands on the flop. He raises c-bets in 21% of the time. We could also put this hand in the c-bet row, but then the row is longer. I want the panel as small as possible. That's why I put it in the last row. Then we have full to donk bet 46 and donk bet 6%. So you can bluff donk sometimes against him and look how he reacts. There are many racks which don't like to fold against donk bets, and you can own them very hard when you just donk your value hands. The last panel is the blind versus blind panel, so fold versus small blind, call versus small blind, and suited versus small blind. You see his sick 46% suited stat, so against him we should try not to raise fold. He is extremely aggressive. What's also extremely important when you try to interpret stats, you see when he folds 51%, how can he 3-bet 46% and call 28%? That's cause in the fold versus small blind the pushes are also included that he can't call or 3-bet. So he folds against open raises and jams 50%. When we want to know how much he is folding to open raises, when we look at his call and 3-bet stat, we see that this is not a lot. When we add the 28 and the 46, we have 74, so his big blind fold to small blind steal is 26%. That's very, very little. So against him, we shouldn't bluff steal so much. When you have someone that is so aggressive in blind versus blind situations, you can add the raise versus limp stat, or just add the stat for the review, because maybe he has a very small raise versus limp stat, and then you can try to steal the pot on the flop. And when he's also very aggressive in this situation, then you just have to be very tight in blind versus blind situations. When you usually open raise 60%, you just have to go down to 40 or 50% or even tighter. Just play tighter, and when you're very tight, you can also exploit your opponents because they are too aggressive. You just make money with your value hands. How you should interpret the fold to 4-bet stat I will tell you in a second. When you're very safe with the stats and you know your HUD, you can remove the abbreviations. Then your HUD will be even smaller and more clearly. Okay, let's move on how to interpret stats properly. It is important that when you only have a small sample, you just have a tendency. They should only help you in marginal situations. They should make your decision a bit easier, but don't over-adapt in the wrong spots. So when he has a very high 3-bet stat after 20-30 hands, and you have a hand that you would normally raise fold, but the hand is right on the edge, you should put this hand into your bet call range, but only make small adjustments and don't raise call really wide. Just don't over-adapt, cause his stat can also just be variance. You should just see his stats as tendencies. You should only make bigger adjustments when your opponents are really unbalanced and you have a high sample size. Like earlier when we had the player with 6k hands. Pre-flop I think you need 800 to 1k hands, then you can make bigger adjustments when your assumptions are confirmed. It's also important that you consider the stats always relatively. So when we have the situation that we have 20 to 25 big blinds and we look at the 3-bet stats and he has a high 3-bet stat, this does not mean that he re-steals very loose. I see it all the time. He has 20% 3-bet big blind versus button. I have to call loser, or he has 25%, and then they call way too loose and they just give him a 25% rejam range. Because think about it, he will also 3-bet small and he will also 3-bet fold sometimes. That's also in the stat. so you have to give him a tighter range and then your calls become minus EV very fast. You think you made a good adaptation, but in reality he jams a normal range and he bluffs 3-bets you just a lot. So when you look into those spots, always look at his full to 4-bet stat. Don't look exclusively at the 3-bet stat, just look also at the full to 4-bet stat. When his full to 4-bet stat is between 0 and 20, then he's rejamming very loose. But when we think on the player from the last hand, he had a full to 4-bet stat of 40%. So his 20% 3-bet stat against the button is not so huge, cause he also bluffs 3-bets a lot. His resteal stat in reality is more around 12-13%. So only look at one stat separately. Look at the stats in dependency to each other. That's very important. The same applies when someone has a really high c-bet stat of 80-85%. Sometimes those players are pre-flop very tight. Often I hear I have to play back at him, I have to bluff check raise a lot, but when he raises 15% from middle position or 20% from the cutoff, he just has a really strong range. So that's a problem from many players. They look at all the stats separately. How does the second part of the story look like? I have another example from a cash game. So player is 3-betting very few hands, and when you only look at his c-bet stat in the 3-bet pot, his stat is 90%, and then many players think that they have to float against him. But when he only 3-bets 5% against middle position, he just has it, and this also applies to many other situations. So look that you don't burn too much money in those spots. You just have to train it and your brain that you not only look at one stat, you have to always look at the other dependent stats. What's also important is that you filter your stats, especially for the number of players. So I think it's useful to summarize 5 and 6-handed, then 4-handed, so before the bubble. When you have a really low sample size, I think it's also okay to summarize 4 to 6-handed, but there are players which change their style of play drastically, 4-handed, and then 3-handed and heads up. You have less hands, but less hands are better than wrong hands, cause in heads up players play totally different than 6-handed. Racks are a bit tighter in the early game than in the push or fold stage, and this also applies to many fish. They are very loose in the early game, and on the bubble they are really tight. When you summarize everything, you have just wrong stats, so fewer stats are better. You just have 10 hands, but you can see a tendency when he plays 3-3. It's possible that he's just really tight in this stage, and when you have his 40-40 style from the early game in his stats, it just counterfeits the stats. I think this is self-explanatory. Try to filter the stats, and when you have 0 hands, just play your standard game plan. That's better than make you make adaptations that are based on wrong stats. Also, it's important to consider the positions. We did this in our HUD. Hopefully you implement this into your own HUD. So the raise first in and the full to 3-bet stats versus the different positions. But I think we talked enough about this topic. I think everyone knows that there is a lot of content out there with all the training sites. For hyper turbos, there's not too much out there, and it also has a huge popularity. But you have to keep in mind that the edges are very small cause the stack sizes are very short. There are more and more sources of information out there. Tools like Hold'em Manager 2, Poker Tracker 4, NoteCaddy and Notesystems. When you're not familiar with those programs, you have to be very good in other spots to compensate that. That's why you should think about your whole approach and bring it up to date. It's also important to not only use the programs in-game. These programs also help you to review your game. You see the spots more clear, you see the connection between the stats, and you get a better feeling for the stats, for the c-bet stats, and that you should include the full to 4-bet stat. You know how the stats develop. It's nowadays extremely important. I think this is a very good saying. You have to move with the times or you'll get left behind. You should be aware of that. When you are not further developed, you'll have a very hard time. I hope you could learn something. This video was a bit different, and I think this video is also interesting for non-hyperturbo sit and go players.